Spinoza on the nature of God. The more we understand singular things, the more we understand God. Ethics, Part 5, Proposition 24. In Ethics, Part 1, Proposition 25, Corollary, he says, singular things are nothing but affections of God's attributes, or modes by which God's attributes are expressed in a certain and determinate way. How is it that singular things teach us about God? Does this give voice to his atheism, pantheism, or panentheism? I will argue that it is a participatory theology based in a process-oriented philosophy of expression, not only through the analysis of affects and a phenomenology of intelligence, but also in an integrative effort to align our diverse powers in ourselves and with others in community. We embody the divine in singular ways so that we understand God in the greatest intensity we are capable of. Whereas the rational proofs expounding God's nature in Part 1 of the Ethics is capable of producing adequate knowledge, it is not the most intense in terms of affects, i.e., in terms of the changing of our feeling and actions. Knowledge of God through singular things is the third and highest kind of knowledge. Imagination surpassed by reason is surpassed by intuition. Ethics, Part 5, Proposition 25. This intuition transforms our power of acting and understanding and transvalues our sense of purpose, obligation, and satisfaction. Part 5, Proposition 27. As we will see, it is in relationality with other singular things, by which he means other human souls, that we participate in divine power by collaboratively developing our virtues. See Sharp, 2019. For Spinoza, it is not possible to understand God adequately and not also feel love and veneration free from all resentment. The love of God is less the love of an object, which implies desires of possession and consumption, more an intransitive beatitude of joyful expression. Thus, our love of God does not involve the want or need for God to love us in return. Such an appetite, he claims, would be impossible, merely a remnant of the inadequate knowledge, the imagined drama that pits selves against each other as vying for advantage and supremacy. This intransitive, non-transactional love of God, Spinoza affirms as evident to all in a true encounter with the divine, an intuitive knowledge of what we might call the power of God or nature. We know God best of all by a third kind of knowledge, beyond reason, wherein thinking and acting, understanding and expressing are inseparable only in thought, but not in their power that they both describe, just as the kenosis unifies the parallelism of attributes in the power and action of the singular mode, such that the mind and the body act as one, so too intelligence and action are one active affect. If we act with knowledge of the effect, if we have skill and precision and bring about what we intend, if we express the reality which is in accord with our essence, that is to say, ways that promote fortitude and generosity of spirit, then we simply are the creative activity of God. God is the adequate cause of existence. If our intelligent action is adequate to not merely conceiving by reason, but actualizing by effort, then we are the conduit of divine creation. God is not just omnipotent in an eternity of the a static quantity of force, but rather God is the increase and enrichment of power, force, movement, and life. When we see the qualities of creative affects in others, we see the divinity in their expressive powers and graceful gestures. Thus, it is through community and social affects that we understand divinity. The infinite intellect and the face of nature. Like Plotinus, Spinoza posited an infinite intellect existing eternally. In some sense, this is God, not as a whole, but only in one of its manifestations, of which there are an infinite number of other expressions, equally as vast and profound as an infinite intellect. We happen to know God only through movement and intellect. Both are the expression of God's infinite power. But the infinite intellect, like the face of nature, think by face of nature, a unison of becoming of all nature together in its multiplicity. This is an integral of both the simple unity and infinitely complex multiplicity. This infinity is the side of expression as expressed, while God and nature, properly speaking, are on the side of expressing, naturans in Latin. Not the power of expression as a statically present potential ready to actualize, like a spring squeezed and ready to release. And not the manifestation of the expressed, but God is this active expressing that is always a present verb and never acts transitively on something else, but unifies action and perseveres in existing. The face expresses a smile, which expresses underlying thoughts, perceptions, and feelings. The infinite intellect is not actualized thought, but the virtual multiplicity that makes possible infinite thought forms. It is not all ideas being known at once, but the infinite interconnection and distinctions that can be thought within a field of coherent deformations. The idea of a triangle, for example, is an infinite potential of construction. A good definition, according to Spinoza, implicates more than it contains. In the very last letter that Spinoza ever wrote to his friend Turnhouse, he briefly responds to the assertion that a good definition deduces only one property. He says that rather a good definition draws more implications than it contains, so that by Spinoza's definition of God, many properties can be deduced, and in a way, all of it follows and is unfolded from this one definition. From his definition of God as a being absolutely infinite, consisting of an infinity of attributes, each expressing an eternal and infinite essence, Ethics Part 1, Definition 6, he deduces the road to our happiness and flourishing. The modes are adverbial constructions conceived through the substantial verb of God's act of expression, singularly existing, where singularly is the adverbial and God is the existing. Every singularly existing is analyzable into a multiplicity of affects increasingly existing or decreasingly existing. Here, increasing and decreasing are the adverbs, and existing is the substantial. Everything is a change in power of existing. Changes of power are qualitatively diverse, so that conatus is not merely an enduring perseverance, inertia, not intensifying, like acceleration, but a transformation and transvaluation of power, enrichingly existing. God is the necessity of existing by being modified in an infinity of adverbs. When we think the idea of the triangle, we are the divine idea itself triangularly thinking or triangularly existing. We are not simply like God in our active affects, not imitations of divine action, as Aristotle and Plotinus say, even though they also undermine the gap with panpsychist talk of pneuma and the soul and divinity of nature and the cosmos, etc. But for Spinoza, we are that very divine activity of expressing, which affirms itself in us, and the more and more we participate in active affects, the more we see this fact that we are not separate from God's power, nor from what is divine in each other. The pantheist principle, everything is God, is only partly true of Spinoza. Not to say that his modes are gods, not, on the other hand, to say that they are less than divine either, as merely mortal or lacking in divine essence. Rather, the way that we commonly think about the existence of things in the world is not true. Our imagination, which cuts the world up into individual entities and treats them as signs that causally interact with each other and with our own will. Since we think through imagination, this framing of the question in terms of finite beings in transitive causal relation misses entirely the authentic question of, is everything God? Another way to say this is that God is more on the side of the virtual than the actual, if the actual be taken as the instant of the present, what is given fully and exhaustively in the present as an entity. As we find the virtuality of our own existence, we find our immanence in God's expressive activity. God is what God does. Existence is God's essence. Infinite, eternal, virtual power of expression that is always expressing and never depleting, multiplying infinities and forming new orders of magnitude of intensity by means of intelligence. Intelligence is more and more viewed as a power to act, less and less the result of presence to consciousness of a reflection or representation. The intelligence of the body is manifest in the order of its motion and rest, of the grace by which its movements are orchestrated. Everything is an expression of divine essence, but there are ways of living such that we do not experience the world in its divinity. We cannot hope to find the divinity willy-nilly. It is by cultivating a sacred devotion in our own effort and intention that we come to find what is divine in others, ourselves, and the cosmos. By kindling our own fire, we undergo a transvaluation that teaches us how to invest our effort and attention. This does not make us into an isolated individual seeking our advantage at the expense of others, but rather, it makes us merciful and generous. Ideas are not just a shared consensus. Consensus is always partial, not just with respect to others, but even with ourselves over time. In place of a consensus between sensing and speaking subjects, there is a communion of minds in the infinite intellect. Here is a clear example of the interconnections of the infinite intellect and how they do not imply a simultaneous actualization of all perspectives at once, but exists as virtual or implicit unity through modulation. The example is that of musical scales. Musicians have long made use of modes, which are not just scales, but are permutations of a single scalar pattern, altered by shifting the starting position. In a sense, the diatonic scale, with its pattern of 7 intervals forming 7 modes, is a singular whole that has 7 distinct perspectives. The pentatonic has only 5 modes. You can only play in one mode at a time, technically, you can play in 2 modes at a time, but this will form a new scale altogether, becoming octatonic or the like, which implies its own modes. And you can modulate from one mode to another, but you cannot play all the modes at once, at least not in a way that makes them recognizable as having a tonal center. Even-numbered scales, like the whole tone scale, which is 6 equal divisions of the octave, or the 12-tone scale, 12 equal divisions of the octave, have no tonal center, but they form their own gestalt with its own quality and character that isn't present in the diatonic scales. Melodies in each mode will have unique qualitative expressive character, and even apart from the effects of culture, the sounds themselves have qualitatively diverse qualities, lending differences to expressive potentials. The infinite intellect is the latent or virtual unity that subtends the changes of perspective implied in each mode. For Spinoza, we are modes of substance in the way a melody is a mode of an underlying coherence between qualitatively different expressions. The composer of a good melody does more with less. This is not to downplay the musical value of fast, complicated harmony, but it's different than melody, judged by its own standards. A good melody, or at least one that's popular, is generally singable and has a playful simplicity of its movement that is easy to remember and has satisfying cadences. Rather than developing harmonic complexity, melody relies on subtle shaping to make the movement evocative and infectious. The composer draws more out of the notes than they contain by patterning them in time. This is the generosity of aesthetic expression, a power to not just craft enchanting sounds, but also to inspire others. The artist stokes the fire of our spiritual fortitude. Their songs encourage ambition and make us see in one another the power we have when we work together, when we form bonds of fellowship. Ethics as transformation and transvaluation. Despite having deeply grasped the profundity of Spinoza's philosophy, Deleuze may have some divergence from Spinoza in that the latter postulated a rational, cognitive act as a purely egoic advantage-seeking, rooting the Cartesian cogito in Hobbesian self-interest. Might makes right. The ancient principle of exploitative politics is living in the gardens of our metaphysics and cannot be dug up and discarded. It will not go away like this in the mind or in community. He uses this rational, self-interested will to power to build the arguments in Ethics Parts 3 and 4. What he shows is, surprisingly, that even the apathetic, rational advantage-seeking will recognize the principle behind the adage, 2 working together is stronger than 3 alone. Advantage-seeking becomes cleansed by intellect, an emendation to the power of the soul that will seek to maximize its own advantage by using intelligence in an experimental optimization of collective affects, joining others in fellowship. Basically, what is evident is that reason can always find a higher harmony which surpasses the rational order that comes before it. If we find fault in reason and intelligence, we are surpassing them with a superior insight. We can change the name of the faculty after this initiation, but it is not of a wholly different order than the intelligence that came before it, if we encounter a new order of magnitude in its emergence. Ethics, Part 4, Proposition 38 and 39 speak of good and evil as merely what helps or hinders rational self-interest. But then again, our greatest interest is that of communal, active affects. Ethics, Part 4, Proposition 46 says, "He who lives according to the guidance of reason strives, as far as possible, to repay the hate, anger, and disdain of others with love and generosity." And generosity is defined in Part 3, Proposition 59 Scholium. By generosity, I understand the desire by which each one strives solely from the dictates of reason to aid other men and join them in friendship. Those actions, therefore, which aim only at the agent's advantage, I relate to fortitude, and those which aim at another's advantage, I relate to generosity, like courtesy, mercy, and so forth. End quote. Love of God, guided by reason, makes us more generous, strengthens our sociability, and opens us to collaborative intensities not possible on one's own. It is a love of the power of intricate convergence, harmonizing complexity by intelligently orchestrating multiplicity. Ideally, we all become drunk on God's essence, and from this jolt of ambition, guided by reason, we use intelligence and sensibility to bring together each diverse person's strengths and needs in order to form a system of affects that maximizes our powers regeneratively while maintaining the embryonic, transformative intelligence singular to each of us in our unique individuations. Each of us is a singular conatus, a singular thing, a singular existent, an effort uniquely striving to preserve an existing based on its concrete situatedness, a singularity that uniquely invents its powers of acting by having ideas affirm themselves in it. An engine affirms an idea. Compression of heat gives off force that can do work if certain solid structures can channel it and convert it into useful forms. The steam engine affirms the idea and communicates its form by performing work. The inventor learns the ratios of motion and rest that efficiently channel the energy into the work and builds a machine in a way that is most useful to its work. There is an essence to the power it has, and the steam engine is only one manifestation. The internal combustion engine takes the idea in a different mode, manifesting its power through uniquely affirming the interconnections. The embodied soul, as conatus, is not merely a machine with a function, not a form with an enduring set of relations, but exists beyond its manifestations in the inventive, pre-individuated, embryonic potentiality. We don't yet know what a body can do. Bodies without brains invent brains for themselves. Humans without language invented their means of expression in sounds, gestures, songs, and symbols. The hand is an organ of organs, an instrument of instruments, just as the brain is the instrumentalizer of instruments and the orchestrator of concerted movements. We also do not yet know what souls can think and feel, what mental activities can emerge between us if we think and feel together. Each mode is a singularity in the divine tapestry of maximal, qualitative, diverse expression. Science, art, philosophy, and political science, insofar as they achieve adequate knowledge, all work to expand our powers of acting and improve our ways of enduring, forming and adjusting ratios of motion and rest. The hubris of Western thought has been to unfailingly cling to the model of atomistic thought, that from a few simple, unchanging parts, everything can be built like a house from wood and brick. Geometrical elements, points and lines, ideas within the ethics, the definitions and axioms, they are nothing like atoms. They contain more implications in composition than is known prior to that assembly. Our nature is such that we not only need each other to live, but to become expressive. It is only in this way that we can convene as humans, not by merely forming consensus about a fact or value, for example, do no harm to one another, but by convening in the powers of the ideas to form a collective resonance through concerted movements and rests. Ratios of motion and rest form a harmonic matrix which relationally integrates activities that unites the multiplicity of forces. By harmonizing our bodies and spirits in community, gathering and working in fellowship, we leap to an order of magnitude, greater intensity of life and expression. The same multiplicity in disorder and interference has no trace of the form and qualities of the integrated order. The conditions of beatitude and harmony do not resemble its achievement. There is as much to be gained by working in fellowship as there is to be lost in enmity. 3, working alone in hate is less capable of violence than if they plotted together. Taken all at once, we as humans have in our hands the power to destroy one another in hate and violence, or work together in love and respect. It is in our nature not only to work together, but to have communal collaboration, which occasions the transformation and transvaluation of our effort. Ambition includes contrary tendencies. For example, there is a passive ambition that feeds on others' power, based on the principle of pulling others down to get up, attempting to gain favor through flattery or by displaying our superiority. But there is an active affect of ambition that includes the desire and the pleasure of pleasing others without wounding our spirit in violating the dignity of others or ourself. Most average Europeans in Spinoza's time had cultivated an antisocial and passive relation to loving God based on the adolescent system of sanction, the sort of game of praise and blame in which the pupil attempts to gain favor before the teacher using any means necessary to appear virtuous, even and especially those attempts to point out the failures of others. In the same way, we seek to make ourselves loved more than others, not only by our parents, but by God. This superficial and confused love of God is completely out of touch with the nature of God. It is merely an affect of greed motivating envy, based on imagining God as a father figure or king, and which easily evolves into various superstitions promoting hate and other various antisocial affects. There is something of childlike wonder and sincerity that is godlike if preserved in adults, the essence of play. There is also a childishness that needs to be overcome if one is to escape from maladapted antisocial affects that perpetuate violence and moral stunting. An intellectual love of God, guided by reason, implies the continual transvaluation of effort as we deepen into philosophical, scientific, and political revolutions. What remains constant in terms of value is the fact that any power of which we become conscious and of which we are capable of developing tends to form an obligation. The awareness of our power to aid others and to enter into fellowship with them forms an obligation to do so. Values change with time, but the power of spiritual fortitude and generosity have remained, in a sense, what they have always been. It looks different in each epoch and depends on singular expressions, and yet is always an active affect, which always has an adverbial structure, increasingly existing. God is the expressive transvaluation that aims at expanding and enriching existence. In a sense, there is no community amongst those who hate and wound each other. There is only community of those who care for and provide for each other's education, research, and flourishing. The economy of affects and the beatitude of acquiescentia in se ipsa, acquiescing in itself. Quote from Spinoza's short treatise, "It is never we who affirm or deny something of the thing. It is the thing itself that affirms or denies something of itself in us." End quote. This is true of our perception, but even more so of our intellection. We should not say, "I think the idea of a triangle," so much as, "The triangle affirms itself in my thinking when I construct and examine it." Despite the myriad of critiques of over-intellectualizing or hyper-rationalism, the majority valid in their reproach, but inept at achieving rapprochement with intelligence as an irrepressible force of our psychical life, there has been no coherent affirmation that negates or drives away the evidence of intellectual activity. The triangular idea affirms itself in me when I understand that its inner angles add up to two right angles. We can each verify in our own experience of intelligence what its power is, that its causality is unlike anything in the sensible world that bumps into something else blindly, mechanically, and transitively. The idea of the triangle is, in a way, non-representational. It is a virtual whole that implicates infinite possible relations within a horizon of permutations. Later, Leibniz would understand this topologically. There is only one triangle that undergoes perspectival deformations that are not falsehoods. It is the truth of the unique angle by which the triangle is viewed. See Halpern 2023, Leibnizing. The idea implies all the possible deformations themselves, not actualized, but as a virtual infinite inner thread that connects them as deformations of each other. Every idea is based on the duplicity of infinity and simplicity. The idea is one in its convergence, plural in its manifestations. The phenomenology of intelligence uncovers these facts that no critique of intelligence can evade. The infinite and yet formal coherent simplicity of an idea thinks itself in me, and just as the blue of the sky affirms itself in each of us as we gather together under it, so the triangle thinks itself in us when we think it. Our minds have become far closer together in Spinoza's vision of ideas in the infinite intellect. We commune in ideas just as we dwell together in homes and towns. In Descartes, our minds are as if in separate universes, both from each other and from our bodies. In the larger cultural trends of modernity, self-love, egoism, individualist values, and this is all reflected in the fighting states of Europe, which each wanted to rule the others with its own customs, The ego is an idea that lives in a mind at war with itself and with others. When we affirm our own nature and that of others, we cannot but feel the intensification of fortitude of spirit and generosity, promoting a sisterhood of mankind. Spinoza can't be an atheist, as many to this day have claimed. This has been suggested by people in every generation since his death. It probably began before his excommunication. To this day, and now, for different reasons, he is still often considered to be an atheist, more often now framed as an inspiration for new atheisms. To understand God's role in Spinoza's thinking is to understand his entire philosophy. It is also to understand a plurality of infinities. The infinite is not one thing of its own kind with a singular nature. There is an absolute infinity of production, naturans, another of expression, attributes, that we experience as infinite thinking or infinite power of moving and resting. And there is a modal infinity of organizing and persevering modes within attributes. On top of these three hypostatic infinities, there are Leibnizian infinities of scale within modes, as well as an infinite web of transitive causes with no linear start or emanative center, what he calls the face of the universe. Above all, the infinite is not merely extension or quantity, but involves qualitative multiplicity of expression and the emergence of singular formal structures. A stick is infinitely divisible into parts. It can be cut anywhere on its extension. In concrete life, these are not mere differences of degree or quantity. Some area of the stick have qualitatively different outcomes. Certain ratios will often have greater advantages and disadvantages. There will often be shadings of potentiality within a certain latitude. There are an infinite number of combinations of the same 7 notes of a diatonic scale, but the composer, when partway through a song, considers what note should go next. Not all of the notes in the scale have equal advantage and beauty. They pick one and not the others because of what came before and where it is going at that very moment. Therefore, potencies change moment by moment due to global changes of the ratio of motion and rest in a multiplicity of moving parts at that moment. There are not only 7 modes of the diatonic, but other possible scalar structures and other possible divisions of the octave. Even in one mode, there are not only differences of degree, but of kind, so that each melody is a singular modal perspective of its own. Like the underlying unity of the triangle and its relation to the truth of any given deformation, so too we affirm of the idea what we can based on our local distortions of modal interdependence. We are not just living in a land of ignorance and then are transported to the heavenly realm of forms. Rather, we live ideas at every moment, affirming themselves in us when we breathe, eat, and work to persevere in existence. We affirm the power of melody when we give it body. Philosophical community, based on mutual aid and democratic generosity, is the only idea that affirms itself in the mind of one who has come to understand the mind and its relation to other minds, the heart in its love of spirit and virtue, and the body in its concerted motions and grace. The blessed community of philosophers. Many parallels exist between Spinoza's ethics and Aristotle's dynamics. power, activity, actuality, dunamis, energeia, and telecheia. Though there are some major breaks worth considering. Insofar as the details of a philosopher's life can illuminate their ideas, which can only ever be in part, not in totality, we find striking overlaps and divergences. Both men were living in places where they were considered outsiders and were not permitted to fully participate in their community. Aristotle eventually having to flee Athens, Spinoza being excommunicated. Aristotle was the son of a doctor and taught Alexander the Macedonian despot in exchange for the rebuilding of Stagira, his home destroyed by Alexander's father, Philip II. His ontotheology was couched in the agency of a doctor of the people. Spinoza was the son of a debt-plagued, failing merchant and was taught by the political radical Franciscus van den Enden, 1602 to 1678. The early proponent of democracy, equality, and religious freedom taught Spinoza not only Latin, but to write radical philosophical texts that affirm democratic republicanism, undermine religious authority, and the mere historical precedent, in order to advocate for equality before the law. Whereas Aristotle saw an ideal of human life and society as fixed and thought its fulfillment was a matter of imitation of a static ideal, Spinoza sees an infinite power of expanding our active affects in a convergent harmony of multiplicity, ever expanding in expressive novelty. The Aristotelian sun despot looms over the philosophy and theology of Christianity. Spinoza sought to free us from these graven images and the false idol of political greatness they encourage. No doubt, Aristotle prescribed a politeia that promotes democratic diffusion of political power through mutual aid and friendship. But he still claims, as necessary, the pushing down of others to pull oneself up. What must the sun god do to keep monsters from creeping up across his empire? This and every system of control, programmed to a static form and valuation, is antithetical to the divine vision of Spinozan reason. God looks more and more like a philosopher than a king. It's likely that philosophers are the best and fastest forming friends, since they are keen to pick up signs of the philosophical and moral virtues in the actions, gestures, and conversations of others, most likely to value these shared strengths and desire to build them up in each other. They recognize this incredible benefit that the other philosopher provides to their own vocation and community. It's the same as with a great and sincere musician when they meet another of similar character, ability, and devotion. All they want to do is make music together as playfully as they can. If they try to one-up one another, it's out of a desire to inspire the other, to outdo them in return, and to surprise each other with what they can do together. There will likely always be fighting among philosophers, but ultimately, the openness to ongoing conversation keeps philosophers in a community that facilitates the expansion and development of an order of magnitude, a sui generis affect that integrates the concrete affordances and optimizes the harmony of our strivings in regenerative ways. Nationality, race, gender, sexual orientation, and other differences cannot rationally motivate discrimination. This sort of discrimination is based in the imagination's susceptibility to antisocial affects like pride, Ethics Part 3, Proposition 26, envy, resentment, and revenge, which are natural to our inclinations, Ethics Part 3, Proposition 55, Scholium. Our nature explains both our antisocial passions as much as our active affects, but in very different ways. Why do people cling to their unhappiness and foster the superstitions and nationalism that keep us in perpetual war with each other, and despite the fact that our greatest power and virtue are formed in community? How is it that we can all find evidence for this principle, the other to man is a god, or two working together is better than three? And we've been told stories of this since we were children in an attempt to inculcate this sublime duty to us. Why do we act as if we can heroically rise above others and be happy by towering above through no authentic improvement of our power, but by merely putting others down? Spinoza traces our antisocial affects back to fear and hatred arising from inadequate knowledge of the causes of things. Viciousness and vengeance are born of a wounded heart that acts in a way that is not adequate to what it desires. Remorse is an affect that consists of a spiritual wounding, painful consciousness of what one cannot take back or undo. It implies the tension of generosity, wanting to undo the damage, with the irreversibility of time and our inability to control our actions so as to avoid the future regret. Envy is the most insidious of the passions because of its prevalence and ease of manifesting in new forms. Envy is the pleasure at others' misfortune or the pain at their fortune. Nothing is more at odds with our spirit, and yet we all experience envy at some point in our lives. Envy is a necessary symptom of a society of people dominated by inadequate or mutilated ideas of themselves and each other. Violence wounds the executor, stunting their moral development, trapping them in the vicissitudes of inadequate knowledge while taking others down with them. The despot tries to raise themselves up by pulling others down. They gain power by weakening others. Honor in patriarchal values and cultures works by not only surplus human dignity granted through veneration, as with the gifts of sensibility, mothers, friends, artists, scientists, mystics, or philosophers, but through a sort of handicap advantage that has not made itself stronger, but becomes so only relatively by weakening others. This weakens the perpetrator of oppression so much that they sink into more and more depraved forms of cruelty. One person is granted dominion over many other people who have now a conditional human dignity. Their value is decided by a sovereign authority and enforced by the populace. Violence and any act aimed at pulling oneself up by pushing others down can have no place in the political sphere of adequate knowledge, cannot be conceived in the mind of one who adequately understands God and the relationship that we have to one another. We each absolutely need each other, not only for our survival, but even more for our skills, flourishing, and happiness. From ambition to vocation. Did we evolve to love harmony by a surplus of pleasures, as with the cognitive cheesecake? Or did the love of the harmonic series evolve to form a surplus of value related to inventing new work activity? That is, creating devotion and vocation. The fact is that purely accidental formations of needs arising from contingent luxuries is not the same as the development of a vocation based on virtues that align with the very nature of our body, mind, and community? Did we evolve to be beings with higher callings, or did higher callings, in some sense, pre-exist human evolution and even had some role in participating the whole system of physical movements? If we don't yet know what a body can do, it's likely we have also greatly misperceived what they have already been doing. The emergence of vocation from action, of a need and even a self-imposed duty to not only act, but practice and develop our action or thought, is a convergence of ideas that resonates as a whole as much as a convergence of concerted movements. The love of harmony is always, at bottom, a love of virtue and power, just as life implies a plurality of vital and regenerative actions which co-contribute to an intensity that forms a whole with a new order of magnitude from its components. So, a vocation directs us to actions and thoughts that resonate and form a sui generis unity. This is grasped most profoundly for us with singular things, individuating with expressivity, active affects based in virtual intelligence, naturans. We understand God through singular things because we see what is divine within them, their power to enrich, expand, and regenerate power. The more we see this, the more we love others and seek to form bonds of fellowship. It becomes a vocation. A vocation is an active affect that seeks to expand, expanding its surplus in order to stretch out and attune to other tensions, but simultaneously, in the convergent affective intensities of the cohesion of virtues, regenerates its reserves and even grows power through a synauxesis, mutually augmenting synergy, both transforming and transvaluing in collective individuation. A vocation is not just fortitude of spirit, but an almost mystical and moral obligation that we place on ourselves, or rather, find in our hearts, that creates an unrealistic overvaluation of the worth of our effort and dedication. A vocation is like a religious investment in a way of life. The surplus of value does not merely accrue value. It changes its nature and aim. It modulates its register of relevance. And ultimately, in the generosity of intellectual, moral, aesthetic friendship, we learn who we are by being defined through our relationships. We gain our virtue by being inspired and encouraged by those who are already cultivating themselves, not to emulate, but to come into an equality of value within a pluralism of needs and enjoyments. One type of music cannot satisfy all our humane needs of aesthetic and psycho-affective reflection and communication. The diversity of forms represent a multiplicity of tendencies, moving possibilities, and nuances that cannot exist at the same time. A soft and slow musical part can't be at the same time as a loud and fast one. But the diversity is necessary, and it is necessarily a mutual displacement in simultaneity like that of modes. Seasonal, qualitative multiplicity of needs. Listening to two songs at the same time from two different genres would never be considered a mixture of the two. It is possible to compose a song that integrates two songs by balancing and weaving certain elements of each. The new song will be as if a mixture of the two, but in reality, it's a new song with its own form. We can combine certain affects, but the presence of some will be more determinative just as the base often functions much stronger in establishing a sense of key center. So, the affects of fortitude and generosity will not entirely eliminate inadequate ideas or our ignorance, but they will hold our values in a much more sincere and self-consistent condition. As our vocation makes us value more and more the investment of our effort, we see more and more the advantages of our cooperative efforts. Spinoza works tirelessly to craft his text machine of mystical illumination via intellectual emendation. Above all, the ethics acts as an inceptive communication of vocation, a challenge to be met with sweat and determination that ultimately depends on our scholarly communities and our ability to foster respect, openness, and conversation. The meaning of freedom, or how to acquiesce in divine determinism. One of the biggest hurdles for many contemporary readers of Spinoza is his harsh rebuke of the notion of free will and the system of sanction based upon it. This difficulty applies to his psychology, which he treats as working in the same way as the construction of figures in geometry, i.e., like lines, planes, and figures. This is actually a less mechanical analogy than it sounds, although it is fully deterministic. Lines and planes build figures. They are component parts. Every triangle involves lines and points on a plane. But lines and points on their own, uncomposed, do not contain the idea of a triangle. Their implication in the idea of the triangle is not akin to a mechanical cause or an ingredient. We might make a metaphor from cooking. Mix some lines and points, bake it or ferment it. Let its internal constitution change as a whole. The irreversible series is constructive insofar as it produces novel conclusions not contained in the premises. While geometrical knowledge is deterministic, you can't have triangles without lines and points. It also involves orders of magnitude, qualitative variations, and novel forms of organization. Emotions do not merely gear into one another in a machine, but rather they compose qualitative orders of magnitude. When certain emotions are cultivated and placed in a series in such a way as to resonate, like the scenes of a play working together to tell a story, or songs on an album, are not only well curated or well ordered, but written from shared inspirations and perspectives. They come together to compose active affects. While they are not free will in the Cartesian or the egoic sense, they do provide Spinoza with a philosophy of freedom in fellowship. Vital intensities, konatai, are never a matter of linear maximalization, but rather latitudinal optimization in a mean state between extremes. If all consciousness is a degree of intensity of effort and affect, if reality itself is a great scale of power on which we are all measured, it's equally true that linear changes on this scale are never continuous. Comparisons are always perspectival, and thresholds abound at which point a shift in quality occurs. Nor can increase in intensity always be correlated with goodness and use, while decrease be bad. Examples abound in skilled action where force needs to be precisely attenuated. More is not better, and sometimes David beats Goliath. Furthermore, optimization of active affects does not always mean a quantitative increase in power. More often, it is a new quality of action under a new idea that makes the biggest difference. What is freedom? To common sense, it means doing what you choose, and what you choose in some way is based on knowledge. For example, choosing an outcome and orchestrating the means to achieve it. And your freedom is measured by how well you fulfill your intention. Second, and negatively, by how it was hindered from the outside. If freedom is understood in this way, as acting well, such that you produce the situation as intended, then this freedom is based in ideas, based, at least partially, in adequate knowledge. If freedom is adequate knowledge that manifests in action, then the cause determining the effect is not free will, in the Cartesian sense, of an indeterminate affirmation, but rather we act by the determination of the idea that affirms itself in us. What, above all, does our freedom consist of for Spinoza? Cohering with others in a way that is in accord with our essence. Since our essence is partly open and negotiable, since we are each singular things existing in unique situations, each of us must affirm the ideas in our own way. Spinoza's big move is to detach freedom from desire, which is passive, always determined by its relation to transitive causality. He then attaches it to the ideas that affirm themselves in us, which is to say that he attaches all responsibility back to God. Why does building a chamber and creating pressure within it actually work to build an engine? Why does using our intelligence to observe and experiment actually work to invent machines like engines? The idea of freedom is affirmed in the inventor when they arrange their thoughts and affects so as to engage in experimenting and experience building. When they learn to organize affects and forces so as to synergize in a coherent activity, is this the work of an indeterminate free will or of the intelligence freely carried by active affects that find what works, letting the ideas affirm themselves in assemblage? To will is to affirm the essence of an idea. Ethics Part 2, Proposition 49. And our biggest affirmations are those that concern our power to form bonds of fellowship, to grow virtues together in collaboration. Can one be free to hurt themselves and others? Is free action anything one does wherein they are simultaneously conscious of their desire and power? The murderer not only acts, but also is conscious of their desire to kill. If there is another affect that is at least as strong as this one, but runs contrary to it, they will vacillate between the two possible actions. When they are aligned with committing the act, they think and imagine every possible method and every reason why the act is justified. When they swing to the contrary, they duly imagine being caught and question their motives. The thought eventually overpowers them and is executed. Remorse, when it arises, will consist of the memory of their desire and their eventual enactment. They feel responsible and that they could have done otherwise. The truth is that the affect that won and led to action were not arbitrarily chosen, but in fact had greater strength. The figures of our emotions are formed from the lines and planes of other emotions. Love of self, love of others. What else are fear, envy, and resentment than refractions of these loves and hates through circumstances that shape them into more complex constructions? How can one feel remorse but if they gather their memory of the various affects and forming them into a unique figure? The intensity and quantity of memories, perceptions, and feelings crosses a threshold and enters into action. Leibniz lifted this idea from Spinoza and modified it with his theory of microperceptions. What happens when something catches your attention from the periphery? Why do we suddenly turn our head to observe something at a random moment on the street? There is an accumulation of infinitely small perceptions. Every perception implies appetites to hear or see better, more clearly, or to vary one's perspective. And as the accumulation of affects, perceptive appetites, gets to a certain threshold, it begins to actualize its force. We suddenly feel a desire to see and hear better. When the turning occurs, we affirm the action and enjoy the achievement. Typically, this happens rapidly and unremarkably, since what we see is insignificant and we go on with our day. Then, moments later, we do the whole thing over again with a new sensation, and so on. Some degree of vigilance is necessary to our organism and is close to an instinct. On the other hand, we are determined by the visible body that is making sound. We are determined by the perceptive appetites that compose the affect. Instincts are, in a sense, active affects, since they are the adequate cause of persevering in existence. In another sense, they are not active, and I don't think Spinoza wants to classify them as active because instincts are ignorant of the scope of the idea that they participate in. They often lead to calamity for the organism. The question of freedom comes down to the perspective of transitive and intransitive causality. If I act under compulsion of external influence, I am by no means a free cause, but a determined one. We are deeply woven in a system of causes that vastly exceeds our comprehension. Our existence is dependent on the climate systems that organize the biosphere. No doubt, we all experience transitive causality daily in which we are determined by an external force. The warmth of the sun is a necessity of life's expansion and development. The plant also collects the energy of the sun in photosynthesis. Some of these actions are determined by the plant's essence, its kinatos, its power to persevere in existence. Its growth is a free action in the presence of external energy on which it depends. We all depend on each other in so many ways. Why do we need to repeat this fact so many times? But this dependency often escapes our notice, and various antisocial affects encourage us to ignore the web of life and things like the invisible labor of women, and to focus on the game of egos, of praise and blame, of partisanship and hate. Everything for Spinoza revolves around breaking the spell of our antisocial behavior, the mutilated ideas that organize our lives and make us keep playing the game. This game is constructed on envy and the confused idea that, one, we can, by our own action, fulfill our desires, and two, that social dynamics can be manipulated to favor one's own interest at their expense. The opposite ideas are true and adequate to our nature, that our highest fulfillment are communal, that we can only work in fellowship, not bondage. And they reflect the nature of our existence, when the true ideas can be connected to situations in which the ego can play its games. We can extinguish them with their contraries. Active affects will gradually shade out the weeded undergrowth of ego and envy, only so long as the ego and envy do not prevail in diseasing the tree before it can grow broad enough to preserve itself. The gardener does all that they can within their knowledge to draw the most out of the plant's active affects. Often its motions and alterations need to be guided, because its tendencies are equipped to respond to multiple scenarios, not all of which are advantageous. For example, If a plant is able to develop all of its shoots, the fruit growth will suffer due to overexpenditure of its energy on this unnecessary task. The gardener prunes the shoots to help the plant grow bigger fruit. Likewise, when one plant has certain needs and another has excessive byproducts that match and satisfy these same needs, they plant them together in a way that allows these to work automatically. The gardener is not using their free will to determine what they desire, but rather achieves a state of freedom in assemblage by organizing the affects so as to promote the maximal symbiosis. They propagate the idea that affirms itself not merely in the mind of the gardener, but in the plants themselves. Whose freedom is this? The gardener will feel some responsibility, knowing that if they didn't interfere in the precise way that they did, that the plants would rather destroy each other than organize. When the architect builds a house and its gardens based on intimate knowledge of geology, hydrology, local ecology, meteorological climatology, botany, and zoology, they will gather the ideas of each of these fields and find how they can optimally affirm the idea of the house and its inhabitants. Freedom is the ability to cultivate the ideas in a community of artists, researchers, and dwellers. It is to expand our affects by communal cultivation of virtues. We cannot hope to manage the world and our fellow community members if we treat them like plants tended by a gardener. But the analogy can be amended to encourage the growth of an insight. We all have tendencies that can become maladapted. The greatest power of our virtue consists in actions which often have no manifest effects, i.e., those of restraining appetites. It takes more effort to stop our attention from randomly flittering with the perceptive appetites of 1,000 microperceptions than in turning our head. It takes more energy to resist our passions than to follow them, even if these passions drive us to the most energized of actions. We must tend and cultivate the garden of affects that we live in together. We all have tendencies that will become antisocial if they are not pruned in conversation. If we cannot endure the vulnerability of open dialogue, if we cannot step out of the game of praise and blame, and look instead to what works and what does not work, and what amends the spirit and what maims it, we cannot experience freedom. Theories of sanction, going back to Plato, have had to answer to Socrates' challenge that punishment often does more harm than benefit, that the wrongdoer becomes more criminally minded through punishment. Teachers can only selectively use insult as a hortatory medicine, and always at the risk of wounding the spirit and entraining the game of praise and blame. There is no freedom in the game of praise and blame, only in the restorative justice which builds a bridge between the criminal and the community from which they sever themselves when they violate its holy sanctions. These laws are based on the very existence of things, natural law written in the book of nature, not human laws, social contracts enforced by the populace as a compromise, rationally balancing one's exposure to danger with the advantage taken over others. No, while human law is optimized only when one can have no unfair advantage over others, no surplus human dignity bought at the price of destroying the dignity of both the oppressor and the oppressed, exiting from the principle of raising one's power only by diminishing another person's. The natural law is evident in the world and in our hearts. Can we live in community and kill each other? Can we be in community and not treat each other with respect and dignity? Can we not live in community? Such a life is in fact an internal civil war of one's passions. We are deeply dependent on each other. It is necessary to our survival, our virtue, and our happiness. And every resistance to this fact is a symptom of mutilated ideas, uncontrollable, maladapted antisocial passions. The fantasy of the rugged individual has been propagated so vastly in so many forms that a pandemic of eidetic mutilation currently predominates the human sphere, as it did already in the time of Spinoza. A young and inexperienced gardener one day cries out, "These God-forsaken ants have eaten my strawberries." Spinoza's blessed tranquility steps in and melts the growing anger. God has not forsaken the ant, but neither has the ant been gifted with the strawberry to my own forsakenness. The game of praise and blame ends when we see the ant as a mode in the web of life. We enter into the divine recreation when we find what other already existing resources there are to alleviate the situation. The problem with the Old Testament commandments in the theological tractates is not that they fail to prescribe necessary moral political correctives, but that they do so in commandments, that they do not explain why we are so commanded. Thou shalt not kill, because killing is deeply at odds with our nature and wounds us morally and intellectually. Thus, according to Spinoza, the knowledge by active affects aligns with Christ and the teachings of Paul, insofar as love thy neighbor summarizes the other 9, because it explains them through action, through the devotion to community building that makes possible authentic charity, the generosity of spirit called agape. I do not blame the ant and return hate upon it. Can the same affect arise in human affairs? Admiring Spinoza's life, one will feel impressed with his sincerity, fortitude, and generosity. The true mark of freedom, the tranquility of abiding in generosity, always returning hate with love. Ethics, Part 4, Proposition 46. Freedom is becoming a machine for the invention of gods, as Bergson said, and the two philosophers met back up in the middle on their opposite paths through metaphysics. We can actively engage in expressing existence, but only when we act in accordance with our nature. It is true that only you can find this truth for yourself. No one can enforce it on you or decide what you feel in your heart. It's also true that we depend on each other, not merely in bodies, but in ideas. When we find our truth in the singularity of our individuation, when we invent a philosophical engine in ourself, in our community, when we build each other up into philosophers. This is always a singular assemblage of affects, and yet it is a conduit of ideas affirming themselves. Everyone has 2 philosophies, Bergson said, their own and Spinoza's, which is perhaps truest of all of Bergson than anyone, and is a fact which Deleuze clearly sought to undermine. Spinoza builds his philosophy in us. It affirms itself in us when we learn to think entirely in the system of citations and interconnections. This is just how it is with ideas. 7 notes forming a system of related modulations between scales with an infinite potential of melody making in each mode. Each mode of the idea encapsulates a whole system of affects and signs, but as a mode that can only work when the other notes are temporarily held in check. The idea implies a duration of thought, moving from one gestalt to another. When we think of a triangle, we are not simultaneously thinking of a circle, at least not with respect to the same figure at the same time in the same way. But we can think of them in relation by means of modulation within the idea of geometry, or topologically through bending and straightening. His idea of freedom, rooted in the infinite power of God, in the infinite intellect, provides us with a space to tranquilly hold each other in the affirmation of our existence, to tend to the garden of our affects, to orchestrate our efforts into a better world that draws more out of us than we knew was possible. In this way, we come to know God through singular things.